Okay, so to start off, you're gonna need 2 squares of, I've been going 9.5 by 8.5 inches. So I'm using a roller mat and a cutting ruler, but you could do this just with scissors and a measuring tape if that's all you have. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cut out 2 of the same. So these 2 will get sewn together to become like the face part of the mask. Okay, there we go. And then for the straps, you're gonna need 4 1-inch strips. And I did 14 inches on my last ones, but I think like a little bit more length is better. So I'm gonna go 16 inches long on this one. So that's like 1 inch wide and then 16 long. So I'm just gonna measure that out here. So I'm going 1 inch, so that's 12, right, 17, so that's 1. Okay, so now we're gonna go press these little strips because they'll become the ties. So now I'm gonna press these in half. So these are gonna be the ties of the mask. You could use something else if you have like ribbon around or rope, or I guess you could even make just straight up ties out of elastic. I had made some masks early on, looking at a few different patterns that had used elastic instead of ties to like go around the ears. But because you're kind of dealing with a one size fits all, the nurses I talked with said that a tie really allows you to get a tight fit on your face, and it allows for different head shapes. So I'm gonna press and serge these to make my ties. But again, you could use ribbon or anything that's about a 1/2 inch wide, that's sturdy, that's not gonna break or rip on you. So yeah, press those, and then I will serge them. I realize that not everybody has a serger, and if you don't, you could probably zigzag these. It's just to keep the edges together and stop them from raveling. So you could probably zigzag it, or again, if you use something else that you don't have to prepare, a ribbon or whatever, that takes out this step. So I'm just gonna quickly serge these 4 pieces. Awesome. Now we'll trim that and move on to assembly. Like definitely the most finicky part. So I'm just gonna separate the 4 ties that I serged, and we'll deal with finishing those ends up later. So we need to, in order for the ties to be attached before we turn this whole thing inside out, we need to kind of stitch them inside. So with the pattern facing up, again, doesn't matter, the pattern doesn't matter. So I'm gonna place them diagonally. I hope you can see with the pattern, but diagonally forwards. And I'm just gonna curl in the middle, because when I stitch this all together, I don't want the ties to get caught in the seams. Okay, I'm gonna take the other piece and make a sandwich with my ties in the middle. Lovely. So now I'm just gonna place those ties where I need them. I always wanna leave a little bit for reinforcing. So I've got that good, I'm happy with it. I'm gonna make sure my squares are flush. This is here in the middle. And I'm gonna pin through both pieces of fabric and the tie to keep it in place. Okay. So I'm gonna make sure this is all matched up along the edge. Check that I still have the angle that I want. Make my sandwich. Okay, so you have a sandwich. Now moving this, I have my quilting table up on my sewing machine, which makes it a bit easier because as I move this, I don't want all this to fall apart. But you should be fine without one. So I'm just going to delicately lift it so as not to move any of the strings. Okay, now we're going to stitch this sandwich together. So I'm going to start, I don't know, about a third away down one of the longer sides, one of the 9.5 inch sides. It's important that this seam stays open because when we turn this inside out, we need a hole to do so. So I'm going to start it again about a third of the way. Do just a few stitches. Okay, I'm using like green thread because again, I'm just using what I have. So I'm using, I think, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just the edge of the pressure foot. I'm going to go all the way to the edge there until I have about a 1/4 inch. I'm going to make sure my needle's down. I'm going to pivot. Okay, you're going to go along over that tie, down the side. Okay, and now I'm back on the side I started. I'm not going to go all the way here because again we have to turn this inside out. So I'm just going to go about, I don't know, another third. I'm going to leave like 2 inches of a seam opening so I can turn it inside out without too much trouble. So I'll stop about there. I'm just going to back tack a few. Okay, and end. All right. Now comes the magical part where we gotta like turn this guy inside out. So you reach inside your hole, your strings come in handy here. Just pull them out. Turn the whole thing inside out. And you should have an inside out square with your 4 ties on each corner. Okay. Now I always do a quick check here to make sure I didn't somehow like slip something. We will reinforce these later, but just checking to make sure nothing. Okay, so we're gonna go press this and put in the pleats and do the top stitching. Okay, so now we're gonna press this. Okay, so I usually pull the corners a little bit. Sorry, don't mind my kids. I'm gonna press it all out. Now this is the seam where we have this hole here, right? So I'm just gonna kind of make sure those edges are inside. Press it. Okay. Okay, so do the pleats or the folds or whatever. Don't have to be anything super fancy. I know it sounds intimidating, but it's not. So I'm gonna put my thumb down here. I'm gonna fold it up using my middle finger to kind of fold it up. It only has to be about, I only use the thickness of my thumb. So I'm pinching this together and then folding it on top of itself. Okay, so I'm just gonna pin this on this side. We're all inside. And do the other side. So it usually works out to be about 1.5 inches. I don't usually measure it because honestly it usually ends up being that anyways. I just use my thumb as a guide, but if you want to check your first few times. The other thing is once you have the pleat and fold done, you don't want it to come, you want to leave a bit of a space here, and it's going to be the same with the top so that when you go do the top stitch, you're not accidentally stitching down the fold. So that's the first pleat. Then I'm going to put my thumb right kind of on that top fold to do the second one. So same thing. I'm going to use my fingers to kind of pinch it. Okay. So again, this fold came down pretty much to this one, and I need to leave like maybe even a little bit more space. That one's not gonna leave me much because I am gonna sew along here to close this seam and top stitch everything. So I need to leave a bit of room for that. Okay, so you can see how it's all folded on itself, and this side as well. Okay. Okay. So now I'm just gonna sew along on top of my folds. Again, using that same like edge of the pressure foot, 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm gonna pull out my pins as I get to them because I don't really want to break a needle. I know it's not the end of the world, but it's just a pain in the butt to have to switch it out and slow you down. If you don't have extras at home, it means another trip out into the land of COVID-19. So I'm just going to avoid that if possible. Right, so I'm going to go all the way to the edge there. Okay, now this is where the space between this last pleat and the edge is important because you don't want to stitch this down. If you do, it's not a big deal, just take it out. Okay, now we're gonna go back around one more time just to reinforce that top stitch. And when I get to the corners, I'm gonna go back and forth a few times just to reinforce those ties because you don't want anything ripping out when someone is trying to cover their face to protect themselves. So I'm just going back and forth over top of that tie a few times. Okay, good. And I'm just going to follow the same stitching line. So you're done. You have your pleats in there. You have your ties reinforced. To finish off the ties, all I've done is tied a knot. And then cut off the serging if there's any thread. And I've done that to each of them. And there you have your mask.